When you're implementing a human resource information system, of course, as I've already implied before, there's going to be resistance to change. People don't like to have their cheese moved, as the saying goes. They like things to be predictable. They often fear change because change means that they might be out of a job because the HR information system can streamline work and therefore they may feel like their relevance has gone away. There are a whole host of other reasons why people resist change, often because they just don't want to learn something new. So again, the resistors, we need to know what the realistic reasons why people resist change, and it's important to ask them. So when we talked about buy-in previously, the buy-in needs to happen with everybody, even the end users, to know what is going on. Sometimes there are people that resist for the sake of resisting, and we need to address that. And let them know that there's an ultimatum. They can use it or they can leave. But for many, their fears can be assuaged. We can investigate what the resistance is about and then try to address that as we try to roll out our program. No change management would be complete without understanding the kind of culture that you have and where your points of resistance may come into play. For example, a clan culture where people are very collaborative may have one reaction to it, and they argue that in a clan culture, you want to have collaboration and buy-in from everybody because everybody's got the ability to resist and to have a strong opinion about things. So where there's collaboration, you want more buy-in. Where there's an adhocracy culture where it's very entrepreneurial in style, there may be risks for people based on uh, the kind of changes that want to be made. And so we want to make sure that we are emphasizing the entrepreneurial nature of these changes and why this timeline is important. And if it's too aggressive, people get resistant. If it's not aggressive enough, people will also have something to say about it. But ultimately, an entrepreneurial culture will want to innovate, but we just want to manage the expectations of that over time. In a market culture, they focus on competition and are aggressive in that context, right? So we need to compete. So if we have a market culture, we need to talk about how this will help us to compete, right? And a hierarchy culture is about having checks and balances and a hierarchy of control. So the HRIS system will help us to be more efficient and help us to manage the control functions in the organization, particularly around HR activities. So again, depending on the kind of culture you have, you can utilize that culture to help you to make the argument why this is a great system. And every culture has a different thing that matters to them. And so we want to make sure that we are utilizing the nature of that culture to help us to make our argument for why it's needed. So Kurt Lewin, came up with this system. It's a fairly straightforward sort of has face validity about how we need to unfreeze the old way of doing things, introduce the new change, and then refreeze with your new system in place. And that's a fairly common practice, and obviously the steps for unfreezing are going to be different from company to company. How we enact the change will be different from company to company, and how we get it to refreeze with a new system in place will obviously also be different. But our goal is to help people to recognize that the old way of doing things is not working. And this plan, this system, will be a way of addressing some of those old problems and those changes. And so once we get them to buy into we need to learn something new, then we introduce them to the thing. We get them trained on it. We talk about the pros and the cons of it, and we try to get feedback from people on how to improve those things. And then ultimately, we refreeze it with the new system in place, making sure that we have trained people adequately, we have great documentation for them, and we have answered their questions. We can refreeze when we get the buy-in that we need from people. It's important as we are getting into the technical side of these things. Again, and I will admittedly tell you that I am not a high-end expert on some of these technical things, but they are important to know because the terminology will be utilized as we get things ready. A database is the starting point, right? It's the collection of organized data that helps us to facilitate the decisions that we need to make. So like any kind of database with our rows and columns and the variables that we need and the input that we have, this helps us to organize our data in a way that makes it easier for us to be able to utilize it. Then we need to have a database management system, which involves the hardware, software, whatever that's used to manage that database. For some people, they use Excel. And for other companies, they have their own proprietary standalone database management software. When I was first graduated from college and I was working in industry in the 80s, we had a thing called DB2 and DB3, which was a database management program, and I learned how to create databases in that software. We want a relational database is a way that we can break data into subsets. And so the subsets of data then can be related to each other and analyzed accordingly. And then, of course, needless to say, there needs to be a relational database management system, a DBMS, that helps us to manage the relational databases. And those relational databases are ways of looking at different subsets of information within the database to help us to understand what happens with this group versus this group and being able to adjust accordingly. So more technical information, a database table is basically the object that holds our database, our stored database, the rows and the columns and the structure in which we need to have the data available to us. The field or the variable is in the column that represents a unique characteristic, and then the record is each case. So case 1 can be employee number 1 and what their information is, and case number 2 is employee number 2 and what their information is. It can also be based on longitudinal data. So depending on what it is you want as your output, you can design your database table accordingly. So your key variable is the thing that connects your relational databases, and it provides us the information needed to link information from one source to another and create the tables that we want, and to bring that data together into the table that is in a usable format for us to use. It avoids redundancies because the last thing we want is to have to clean up data after we have the systems integrated. So want to make sure when we're using these key variables that the key variables are going to ensure that we don't have redundant data in the databases that are going to require more time and effort for us to clean up. The database form is the way that we set up our interface. So the form lays out the information in the dashboard the way that we want it. It makes sure that we accept only certain pieces of information. It does not allow for redundancy. It minimizes errors and makes sure that we can utilize this, and it'll look very similar to a paper application, right? But it's just a data-filled form. And you've seen these things. I know if you've done online forms, they have different data boxes and you can fill stuff in. But whatever that form is the interface we use for the data input. And so make it easier for us to access in our dashboard portal. A query is the question that we ask the database. I need to know all the information from this date to this date on these variables. Or I need to know the relationship between this variable and that variable. So my table needs to, the chart, the output chart that I get needs to include both of these pieces of information on it. So there are structured query languages that we're supposed to use to be able to manage and maintain the database. And it gives us sometimes it's great to have it as a point and click. We just know this is the question I want to do, and behind the scenes the query language database knows exactly what it is, what the command is, and it accesses that data and provides it does the query for you. This is a lot like the icon point and click that transitioned, normal DOS language, C colon backslash command code to point and click to get access to the data that you want. So there's a query language behind the scenes that says, oh, when we click this icon, that means Robin wants this data and that data put together, in a format that's usable. The report then is the output that we get, whether it is a chart or data, raw data, or whether it is in a report format with the relationships outlined the way we want it. The reports are easy to come from the tables and queries that we've developed. And so that we get the access to the information in the way that we want it. And the report gives us the same results every single time. Whenever we ask for this certain report, it knows exactly what it wants to do. It generates the report and it ships it to us in whenever we want to, whether it's monthly, quarterly, annually, etc. The system users are basically the people who are putting the input in, because they're a system user, because they have to input the data, and then the people who will need to access it to get the reports to help them use the data to make HR information system decisions. Obviously, all of your managers need to have access to this because they need to have access to employee data to help manage their employees in the best way possible. It also is anybody in HR needs to have access to this from an input and an output report perspective. And sometimes the CEO will want this information because they want to be able to look at the data in advance and be prepared for meetings with the HR professionals on the people management side of things. So no matter what, we want to make sure all of the potential end users or system users are involved in the design process because their feedback will help us to make better decisions. There are other people that should have access to your HRIS outside of the system. For example, if we're working with a consultant or a third party that's providing resources for us, they need to be able to have access to that information. Job applicants need to have access to that information as well. So anybody that may, and if you have a connection, for example, with a payroll company that does your payroll for you because you don't want to do it in-house, those third-party individuals need to also have access to that database to be able to access the data they need to generate the paychecks for people as they need it. So there are people in-house that need access, and there are people outside of the company that need access. And so we also have system architectures, and again, not an expert on this, but I'm giving you the basics of what I understand it to be. Single tier architecture is a mainframe, right? What we can all access and everything is accessed on the mainframe. A client server architecture, which is a two-tier system, basically means stuff is stored in one location, and then my terminal, my interface, will give me access to information separately. So there's two tiers to it. There's where it's stored and then where it's processed, in the second location. And then an N tier is obviously anything greater than 4. It's multiple tiers. It depends on how it's being used and why it needs to be used in that manner. I cannot think of any examples off the top of my head, but basically N tier architecture is multiple tiers involved. Lastly is cloud-based architecture, which many of us should be familiar with. Things like iCloud or Google Drive or OneDrive are all cloud storage units. And they can store information. They can create databases can be stored there and accessed easily. And then the software as a service refers to software, hardware, and applications controlled by a third-party entity. So somebody else manages it and then I access it through them. So these are all the basic technology questions regarding information HRIS systems. Some of this terminology you should already be familiar with because of your taking CMIS courses, but it's unique in how it's used in HR information systems. It's unique to the people management side of things.